the transition between power.
Between the PowerPoints, yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
So I think we can switch to this one, and when you are ready, just tell me okay. I'll send it okay to Laura, and then it's gonna be showtime.
Sounds good, and this is just on already? Hello?
They're all on.
Hello? It's on. Okay.
Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Laura Vigo and I'm the curator for Asian art at the museum. So I'm very happy to have all these new faces and faces that I already know, I see you there, to this fantastic event. And I just wanted to do a little preamble just to explain the reason why we're doing this table ronde. First of all, I like to think that the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts could be a museum in progress. As it's once called encyclopedic, it is in fact a collection of collections that rather speaks of the people who contributed to its making through its over 150 years of existence. Today, in a world that is constantly redefining itself and is embracing the fluidity, the entanglement, and the interconnectedness of it all, the institution seeks not only to conserve and preserve the multiple relics of different material cultures that are in the museum, but also to elicit new interpretation, ask new questions, and allow the many voices from outside the choir to contribute to the co-creation of knowledge. Our Gallery for the Arts in One World is based on a transhistorical, transcultural, and diachronic perspective and the theory of in-betweenness, and seeks to address the inconsistency, the fallacy of a universalist museum. Instead, the galleries embrace the relativity of the collections, their awkward circulation, a museum translocation, their social life in motion, so to speak, as well as their worldly connections. In order to enhance such worldly connections while subverting the original Eurocentric canon of art is not an easy task, though, but the process of decolonization may start only when questions are raised while answers are yet to be found. The museum does not hold the truth, but may be a congenial platform where different truths may converge or diverge. So we are here to discuss, to listen, and find strategies together, hopefully. The recently inaugurated Gallery of Sikh Art in the Art of One World Galleries was possible precisely at a time when our museum started questioning its pertinence and sought to embrace different realities, all contributing to our society and ways of life. Supported by many members of the Sikh community, to whom I will always be grateful, the new permanent space is just the starting point for deeper and wider conversations. So where can we go from now and from here? This roundtable, led by Sajdeep Somal, and made possible thanks to the Conseil des Arts de Montréal as part of the series Rethinking the Museum, will address and suggest possible venues of future development, and we are all ears. Sajdeep Somal is a PhD student in the Department of History at the University of Toronto. His research focuses on science and technology studies, the history of consciousness and madness, I love that, and contemporary art practices within and beyond South Asia. Transiting through disjointed nodes of the past, his dissertation work aims to work through and thicken the study of decolonial technoscience, chemical kinship, vernacular conceptions, toxicity, and the body, techniques of corporate sovereignty, the discipline of chemistry, settler colonialism, and the science of breathing. I definitely need that after all this. He also serves as a chairperson of the Canadian Filmmakers Distribution Center, the CFMDC, a collective member of Sangham Film, and as a programming committee members of InterAccess. So I'll leave the stage to Sajdeep and his fantastic panelists, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
One?
Okay, yeah, totally. Did you hear all of that? I was just saying thank you so much to Laura for the wonderful invitation, and I'll get a chance to introduce all of the panelists shortly. I just wanted to say that I do have some brain fog, so I might be reading out and taking some pauses. I recovered from COVID a couple weeks ago and still dealing with the after effects, unfortunately. I guess I developed an interest in Sikh art during my time working at the South Asian Visual Arts Center. And over the past couple of years, I've had the pleasure of working with on some curatorial projects with diasporic Sikh artists. And it's kind of drawing on some of that experience that I'm going to be talking about, the collection of Sikh art that we have here now at the MMFA, and how we might kind of bring some of those insights into this work. And so over the past couple of months, I've had the pleasure of inviting and speaking with the kind of three brilliant, very thoughtful, and engaging panelists that we have here with us today, Pasha Khan, Balbir Singh, and Megha Sharma Sadev. And so I've invited them all to deliver about 10 to 15 minutes of remarks about the new Sikh art collection and gallery at the MMFA. And then after we hear from them all individually, I'll be asking a couple of general questions to the panelists and inviting them to kind of dream up, what would the best kind of Sikh art gallery that they could ever imagine look like if we didn't have, any constraints at all whatsoever. And kind of just be in that real kind of space of dreaming and visioning in our conversation. And then I'll open it up to the audience for any particular questions that they might have. Yes, but before I kind of do that, I kind of want to frame the talk a bit and invite you into some of the questions that I've been thinking through and have kind of shared with the panelists beforehand and invited them to think through as well. So I'm going to just start off by introducing some overarching thoughts about the politics of representation that kind of dominates Canadian art engagements with artists of color, and think about how that constricting paradigm shapes the work that's kind of produced in the kind of contemporary Sikh art world. And how we might kind of shift or disturb that. And this is going to kind of lead into a brief consideration about the possibilities of building a gallery around, the idea of Sikhi not as being necessarily an identity or a nation or a religion, but instead as a method of engagement. And so, particularly, what would happen to the gallery if we took Sikhi, which means kind of learning, as a curatorial method, and we put together objects and sort of collecting around this paradigm of learning and collective learning that I think is at the heart of what Sikhism is. And so what I'm going to do with that approach in mind is I'm going to offer a kind of a rereading of one of the Fulkari chutneys that's in the collection, and kind of follow what's in the object and the places that it might take us in the world to really kind of show how entangled all of the kind of forces are that have made up our present. Yes, so I can start off. I'll be introducing the panelists right before they speak and delivering their bios, so it's like on the top of your mind. I love this technology. So nifty. So first I kind of want to just talk about, some issues in the politics of representation. And so, with this kind of dream of building a multicultural Canada in the 70s and 80s, what we had was a lot of kind of Canadian art museums interested in diversifying their collections, in collecting work by artists of color, by Black artists, by Indigenous artists. And, one of the ways those projects were framed was in the discourse of representation, right? Which was kind of challenging for these artists because they were being asked to represent their communities. What is the culture of a community? Who are your people, right? And those were kind of some of the animating forces, right? Market forces, really, that then were, I think, in turn shaped the type of work that artists of color made, right? Because they were like, well, this curator is only going to collect, my work if it, is a good representation of who my people are, right? Rather than maybe being, an in-depth philosophical consideration of some of the things that they are working through in their day-to-day lives, right? And so we might think about kind of how those artists decided to respond to what collecting paradigms looked like as they were directed towards communities of color in the 1990s, right? And so I had a chance when I was working at SAVAC to delve into their collections around Desh Pradesh, which was this multidisciplinary and queer South Asian arts festival that ran all throughout the 90s. And what they were doing there was they were really grappling and struggling with this category of South Asian, you know? Who does it mean? Who can be included within it, right? Who's not South Asian? And they realized that those borders were not really helpful, right? That instead they needed to kind of find a vision of South Asia that didn't stem out of the kind of geopolitics, right, under which it emerged, right? The term South Asia emerges in the Cold War, right, as this, you know, geopolitical space that the U.S. is kind of concerned about and wants to maneuver around. And then it becomes a kind of a cultural and then, you know, in some cases even a racial category. And so they kind of offered a different definition of what South Asian was, which that, you know, South Asian is a masala mix, right? And so I want to kind of really think about, like, what is a masala mix, right? Is it just kind of a combination of totally different spices, right? And do they stay distinct when you make that masala, right? Or is there something that actually happens to those different spices that you put into the masala, a way that they actually decompose and recompose with one another and actually create new flavors, new chemical compounds, and a new thing entirely, right? And I think that was kind of the force of what this kind of South Asian, as you know, masala mix was really about, right? Really about how the world is kind of filled with different forces, right, that commingle and become entangled, right? And at a point are kind of inseparable. And so, you know, in doing that, it was like, well, almost anyone and anything could be South Asian, right? It kind of destroyed the boundaries of what constituted that category, right? You know, I think about how, you know, my white boyfriend, right, speaks Punjabi half the time to me. And, you know, there's a way that he's embracing and entering into a whole world, you know, through our relationship that we're both working on, you know? And so that's kind of one of the, you know, the sites of entanglement that we might think about. So they were trying to do this with the category of South Asian, right? And I'm curious, could we do something similar with the category of Sikh, right? You know, where does Sikhism go? Whose lives does it touch, right? You know, what does it constitute? What are all of the different places that it's traveled, that it's gone? Right? And how might that kind of offer us a kind of a very fluid and dynamic definition of what might constitute Sikh, who its communities might actually be, right? We can think about all of the, you know, the people who kind of visit gurdwaras, right? Who might kind of not accord to our kind of traditional definitions of Sikh, but who are maybe kind of moved by or transformed by, you know, some scriptures or something. So, kind of based on this method of kind of having an open-ended idea of kind of what Sikhi could be, I want to introduce this idea that I have that Sikhi could be a curatorial method, right? If the idea of, you know, what means Sikh is like to be a disciple or a student, right? And to practice Sikhi is to be kind of in a perpetual state of learning, you know, in your life. If we were to take that into the kind of curatorial space, well, how would that totally transform what we end up collecting and what we end up putting together under this kind of new category of Sikh art? So I want to offer some examples of kind of where this might take us. I'll get back to the last slide. But, you know, this is an image from Gauri Gill's The American series. It's called A Woman Worker at Sunsweet Prune Packing Factory, Yuba City, California, 2002. If we think about what Gauri Gill is trying to capture in the American series, right? It's on what are Sikh Americans doing? What are their lives like? What are the things that they're trying to work through? What is it that they're trying to figure out? What lives are they building, right? And here we get this, you know, vision of, you know, a Sikh woman who's a factory worker, right? who's behind these kind of shipping crates of prunes. And we can actually try and ask this question of, if we have Sikhi's a curatorial method, where learning is our method, what would we be learning with Gauri Gill as she goes on this journey? What was Gauri Gill trying to get at and trying to get us to learn about and think through, right? And I think in this photo, she's asking us to kind of think with this factory worker, right? Think with this woman whose day involves going to this factory and who, I'd imagine, has a lot to say about how capitalism works, right? I think there's a way that we could think of her as a theorist of capitalism, right? A way that we could see her as a theorist of someone who might kind of offers good wisdom on how to live our lives based on her own experiences. And so I wonder, what other objects in the museum speak to these questions around labor, around capital, around gender? And can we put them in kind of productive dialogue with this? Would that be the kind of product of a Sikh method, right? One that's committed to ongoing learning? And in another register, I'm kind of curious and I wonder, what could we offer, right? In our own kind of journeys of learning, what do we already maybe potentially know that might be really helpful to this woman or to Gauri Gill? And so I want to move to this other piece, which is a kind of a close-up snapshot of this work by Jagdeep Rana, which is a kind of a part of his kind of really brilliant tapestry work. And in between these two ladies who are standing in an agricultural field is a cotton seed flower. So in the caption kind of below, which is not included here, but Jagdeep Rana writes, please strip these women of these chemical cotton flowers. And with that caption, what he's inviting us to do is to think about how agricultural laborers are at the forefront of dealing with the health impacts of like synthetic agricultural chemistry, right? And so I kind of saw this piece, and I'd been talking to Jagdeep Rana kind of a number of years ago about, it was a kind of in the context of the farm worker protests around, what about this synthetic chemical surround that is enroping everyone in the Punjab, right? Where they've been able to kind of distribute pesticides that are illegal, in North America, because when they put in legislation here, this big, large chemical corporation said, well, we're gonna go and sell our chemicals elsewhere, right? And forced kind of India's hand to let them sell these really toxic, dangerous pesticides and other industrial chemicals there. So how might I actually kind of continue delving into research on synthetic chemicals, right? In order to actually assist with the kind of journeys of the subjects that I'm seeing, right? Instead of just kind of remaining in this maybe descriptive mode, right? Because I could easily describe the techniques that are used to make this tapestry, right? But I'm not then really engaging with the learning struggles that both Jagdeep is doing as well as his subjects are doing, right? Which is trying to figure out, how can I craft a good life, And that's where the promises of kind of turning to agricultural chemistry are, right? Maybe if I use this chemical cotton seed, right, I'll be able to have enough money to eat, right? I'll be able to reap good crops. But I think I know, and I think many people have known for a long time, that there's a lot of debilitating effects, right, to monocultural plantations, for example, right? And so, the idea here is that what we might do by taking Sikhi as a curatorial method is that we might engage on journeys in theory, right? In theorizing stuff with both the artists that we're working with, as well as their subjects, right? And which kind of really disturbs one of the kind of major premises of the museum, right, is that it deals with objects, right? Objects that are kind of static and a bit lifeless, right? Instead, we're offered forces in motion, right, that might actually transport us and take us to new places. And so I want to just do a quick reading of the Fulkari Jinni and situate it within the context of petrocapitalism. which is not necessarily one that we might think about it with. And so I'm going to talk about what I'd like to call the museological archives of petrocapitalism, because it sounds sexy, you know? And it looks like it'll get funded. So here's a picture of a Fulcati chimney that's in the collection. And so you might be kind of wondering, well, how do we get from Fulcati to petroleum? There's probably a billion ways we could do this. That's the whole point of entangled worlds. But I'm going to trace out just one. And so, but to kind of give a bit of a brief context, right? The Fulcati is a kind of form and style of weaving that is kind of particular to the Punjab. And oftentimes Fulcatis are kind of, and the methods that are used to construct them are defined as kind of like using the discourse of kind of, traditional craft, right? Where it's this traditional practice, right, that's almost static and fixed in time, right? That it's not kind of dynamic, modern, or changing, right? But a lot of those Fulcati objects, that are in this collection are from the 19th century. They're from the 20th century, which means that they're modern, right? They're a product of modern times. They're the antithesis of the pre-modern. And the traditional. And so one way that we can kind of see that in both this work and then this other Fulcati work is by the use of colors. You see this vivid yellow, you see this vivid magenta, even a really quite vivid white, right? And the brown that's used to dye the cloth upon which they've woven the Fulcati patterns on. And so I had this question of, well, where did these synthetic dyes come from? Who had made them, and how did they arrive here, right? And what was it about them that, the person who would have woven this together decided, oh, I'm going to go with that, right? And so the whole promise of synthetic dyes, right, as opposed to natural dyes, popular before 1800, was that they would last longer, right? And that you can get really bright, vivid colors out of them. But I was curious, how did this whole story of synthetic dyes begin? And so it actually begins in cokeries, which were the plants that were used to distill coal and manufacture coke and coal gas that was used as one of the earliest fossil fuels. And so the residual waste product, when they were making this kind of more refined carbon fuel, was coal tar. And in the kind of mid-1800s, around the 1830s, 1840s, there was this real interest in asking, well, what can we do with all of these waste products from the cokeries? Because economically, it wasn't a really good decision to let things to go to waste, right? These capitalists really wanted to actually capitalize on the waste products of their plants. And so there was one chemist, August Wilhelm von Hofmann, who was a German chemist who started researching and distilling coal tar and was able to distill aniline from it. And what he did was he took the coal tar, he distilled it into benzene, then into nitrobenzene, and then into aniline in its impure form, and then created aniline purple or mauve dye. And when they were able to kind of further synthesize it, they were able to make yellow, blue, green, magenta, some of the colors that you see here, right? That was the first generation of synthetic dyes. The second generation of synthetic dyes, I'll spare you all of the names and just speed it along, but they were iodies, and they were reacted diazonium salts with aromatic amines, and they were manufactured by German chemists similarly in Manchester. And their two kind of primary colors was a really bright red and this brown that you see here. And these were called AO dyes. And then they decided, and they came up with a third generation of dyes because they discovered new ways of doing chemical analysis, right? That wasn't kind of, the simple kind of process of distillation, right? The way that you distill chemicals is you can use an electrical force, or you can put all these different types of reactants in them in order to kind of get one element out. And so what they did was they created alizarin dyes that were similarly from coal tar that was distilled into anthracene. And then through kind of oxidation and then sulfonication and then alkanization, they ended up with alizarin and created the whole world of alizarin synthetic dyes. And so these could be any of those dyes, any combination of them. Those are the ones that were kind of popular and were starting to be distributed globally around the time of this kind of Folgati's manufacturing. And it's great that we now know this, but what's the kind of point in delving into, the kind of synthetic composition of the dyes used in this Folgati? Well, it's because all of those dyes have different health impacts and health effects. And so the first generation of dyes, the aniline-based ones, were toxic if they were ingested, inhaled, or placed along your skin. And what aniline does is it damages your hemoglobin, which is the protein that carries oxygen through your blood, right? To go to your muscles, to go to your organs, so that you can live, right? And so if you're kind of consistently exposed to aniline dyes, you can have all sorts of issues: anemia, headaches, tremors, paralysis, etc. And so there's a way that aniline reduces the quality of your life, right? It can actually be really, really damaging. And similarly, or I guess maybe not similarly, but in a different way, the iodides and the alizarin dyes are carcinogenic, right? And they cause cancer, right? And so, we can kind of maybe think about the ways that the distribution of all of these synthetic dyes globally, right, is also a part of the kind of rise in rates of cancer, right, that we see throughout the 20th century. It's also a part of, actually debilitating and maiming the people who sought to use it, right? And so all of these kind of stories, right, and material effects are here for us to understand and explore when we look at this Folgati chimney. I'm doing that thing now, I'm getting the brain fog. And so how might we actually now take this to kind of our contemporary present, right? So many of the materials that they use in Gurdwaras, for example, Rumalla Sahibs, they're made using synthetic fibers with synthetic dyes, and then oftentimes they're ritually cremated, right? So they're using plastics that have synthetic dyes and they're burning them. You can imagine the carcinogens that are being released in those ritual burnings. You can imagine, the kind of toxic effects of kind of clothing yourself, and all of this. And so this is kind of a not just kind of a historical issue, but a kind of contemporary political one as well, right? That we might kind of delve into further, right? And it's one that Sikh artists particularly, are interested in, right? They're thinking through textiles. They're thinking about the materiality of textiles. They're thinking about the composition of those textiles, how it's manufactured, what are the kind of impacts for the laborers who are making it, right? And so how might we engage with those kind of artists, right? And platform their work in order to activate a piece like the Folgati, right? The kind of contemporary artists that we seek to, to put in dialogue with the Folgati chimney doesn't need to be an artist who makes Folgati themselves, right? It could be one who's kind of maybe similarly thinking through kind of concerns around synthetic dyes and health impacts, for example. Interestingly, right? It's the companies that create the kind of third generation of dyes, BASF, which is this German chemical company that ends up manufacturing the chemical weapons that are used in the Holocaust, right? And so really this story can take us to all sorts of places. We can also think about how these chemical corporations are also also kind of take over the world of agricultural biochemistry in the 1970s in the face of kind of, rising oil prices, right? And they were like, we need to expand our markets. And so that's when they invest a lot of money in producing the new cotton seeds. And that takes us back to Jagdeep Rana's piece, right, that I was showing you before, right? And so petrocapitalism, right, is also there in that cotton flour, in that chemical cotton flour. What I'm hoping to kind of show by taking on this journey, right, is there's so many ways that we can stretch, right, these museological archives, about the content within them, so many ways that we can activate them, right, to tackle really pressing and important political issues that we can all kind of gather around, right? I think not a single person in this room will say, that cancer isn't, a massive issue, especially when those chemical corporations also run the pharmaceutical corporations that offer the therapies. Some of the kind of therapies that are offered for cancer. Anyway, this is kind of turned into a bit of a political spiel now by me, but I just want to end off by really reinforcing, right, this idea that we do live in an entangled world filled with forces, that can't be neatly contained, right, within, the container of Sikh art, exactly. But when it's used kind of as a referent for identity, nation, or religion, right? But instead, if we take Sikhi, for what it is, right? For its commitment to kind of ongoing learning and study, right? It can take us anywhere, right? And it can take us to a place where we can really grapple with some of the issues that are really meaningful to all sorts of people. So that's pretty much everything that I have to say on the topic for now. Okay, thank you. I'm happy to pass over the mic now, not this mic physically, to Pasha Khan, and then on to the other panelists. So Professor Pasha Khan is an associate professor and chair in Urdu language and culture at McGill University. He's interested in the narrative Qissa genre and storytelling in languages such as Urdu, Hindi, Punjabi, and Persian, as well as South Asian literature more broadly. He's the author of The Broken Spell, Indian Storytelling and the Romance Genre in Persian and Urdu. Among his other research projects, he's currently writing about the text produced for Maharaja Ranjit Singh. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Sajdeep. Can you hear me? Is my mic on? Great, wonderful. All right. So first of all, I want to say that I got my second COVID booster, plus the flu vaccine yesterday. So I can feel the antibodies having a war against those vaccines in my body. And I think that it's important to make these disclaimers before giving a talk, because it wards off the nazar, and I'm very afraid of the evil eye. And with Sajdeep's kind invitation of me, I feel as if the evil eye is very much on me right now. So I'm grateful to Sajdeep and to the MMFA for inviting me to think about the Sikh Gallery, for inviting me to see the Sikh Gallery, which Laura Vigo very kindly showed us a couple of days ago. And I think that I don't have a presentation as such, but my comments are going to follow upon some of those of Sajdeep in both the contrary way and in a consonant way. Sajdeep has, and I think, contrary not in the sense of oppositional, Sajdeep has showed us how some of the materials used in, for example, Pulkari, can take us around the world, the kind of the global nature of this art. And what I want to do to begin with is to focus on the local, right? Because very often when we see Sikh art or South Asian art, even if you go to the Sikh Gallery and the floor that it's on at the Musée des Beaux-Arts, it's very much about the world out there, right? Over there, some place that is not here, right? But, of course, there are Sikhs and South Asians here, right? I mean, we're here, right? And aside from us, there are Sikh artists around in Montreal. There are South Asian artists here present. So Hassan Ashraf, for example, who is sitting right in the corner with the mask. We have Swapna and Aman, who are sitting in the second row. We have Charlene Bambot. I'm going to call out on all of you. We have Himmat, who actually makes pulkari, and who must be, maybe one of your pulkaris will be in the museum one day. Who knows? Okay. So I think it's important to recognize the presence of local artists in this city and in this room. And one of the questions that I want to pose to the artists themselves and to the audience and to my fellow panelists is how we can make room for artists of color, South Asian artists, through the relatively elite space of the Musée des Beaux-Arts, now that we have this fantastic collection in our midst. How can we open up those kinds of opportunities? And I don't want to say too much more about that, because I'm hoping that we will actually have a discussion and that folks will speak up from within the audience, whether you're artists or not. So that's my kind of seg with regard to the global nature of this kind of art. The other thing that I want to say is that, of course, one of the things about the local context is that that on the one hand we are. The Sikh gallery contains images of the Sikh gurus. There are a lot of turbans represented in these paintings. And so we're celebrating these images of people wearing turbans, and yet we're living in a Quebec that limits the opportunities to turbaned Sikhs through Loi 21, which is currently back in the courts, by the way, as of Monday. And we need to recognize the kind of the contradiction between that kind of celebration on the one hand and the glass ceiling that is presented to turban-wearing Sikhs. So, for example, I'm sure that you know that Amrit Kaur, who is a Montrealer, a Sikh who was, I believe, born in Montreal, and her parents are still here, and who trained to be a teacher, had to move to British Columbia in order to be able to teach, right? So something that this tells us, the whole debate around laïcité, this form of closed secularism, is that there's a particular preoccupation on the part of Quebec in particular with the category of religion, right? The idea of religion. And my question is whether religion is a useful category or not. And I'm a professor at the Institute of Islamic Studies at McGill, and from the very beginning of its existence, it was founded in 1952. And note that it is not part of the religious studies school, right? That is in part because from the very beginning there was a critique of the idea of religion, the idea that there is something that can usefully be called religion or religions, right? And in particular, Sajdeep has begun with the idea of Sikhi, right? And more often in English we're used to hearing the term Sikhism, right? and of course, this kind of preference among many of the term Sikhi to the idea of Sikhism comes precisely out of an implicit critique of the idea of religion, which Sikhi is particularly good at troubling, right? So this idea of religion has been critiqued multiple times by scholars of Islam, scholars of South Asia, because the categories of Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, etc. in South Asia are so messy historically, difficult to pin down. And so many of the items in the Sikh gallery already mess with our prejudices and our preconceived notions about religion, right? So, for example, the portraits of the gurus are in a style that, if many of us looked at them, we would say that it's a Mughal style, right? And therefore implicitly linked with the Islamic. But what is Islamic about this style? I mean, we need to think about it in another way. The Janam Sakhi manuscript, for example, this manuscript about the lives of the gurus, and in particular Guru Nanak, is written in Braj Bhasha, which is a form of, we usually think of it as classical Hindi. And because scholars of Hindi literature have associated Hindi with the Hindu identity, they have, for the most part, ignored Braj Bhasha literature in the Gurmukhi script, in the script that is most often used for the Janam Sakhi manuscripts, for example, right? So, I think that the items in the Sikh gallery are already challenging our notions of religion, the category of religion, as the current political discourse, not only in Quebec, but also in South Asia, define it. And I hope that challenge to these kinds of categories will continue. And I think there's a long history of this and a long kind of artistic tradition of challenging these categories in Punjab and in Punjabi literature. So, just to give you a little bit of background that explains my interest in this, I'm the chair in Urdu language and culture, right? Whatever. But I'm a Punjabi, right? And in fact, I had initially wanted to study Punjabi literature rather than Urdu or Hindi literature or anything like this, but it was just that there were no opportunities presented to me, right? And that's something that, of course, needs to change. But I'm also a Punjabi Muslim, and of course. Being a Punjabi Muslim, I want to be careful not to attempt to define Sikhi as such. But for example, there's a very famous poem by Dr. Mohan Singh, who was an East Punjabi writer, which was very famous in Pakistan as well after its formation. And it goes, Rab ek gunjal dar pucharat, Rab ek gorakh tanda, kholan lagyo bet usta, kafir ho jaye banda. Right? So, how do I translate that? I don't. It's a poem that says the Lord is a mystery filled with knots. Rab ek gorakh tanda. The Lord is a secret, a mystery, a riddle. So when you begin to open up his secret, you become a kafir, an infidel, a non-believer, right? And this whole poem is about the idea of a khoj, a search, right? And so, this speaks to Sajdeep's idea of learning on the one hand, but also searching continuously and endlessly for these kinds of meanings. So, in order to illustrate that, I don't have an image or PowerPoint or anything. But when Laura Vigo took us into the bowels of the museum and showed us, for example, one of the images of the gurus in particular. This was an image of the Guru Tegh Bahadur, who was murdered at the hands of the Mughal authorities. And it shows Guru Tegh Bahadur, and above it, as Megha pointed out, there is an inscription with his name, not in the Gurmukhi script, but in the Devanagari script, interestingly, which is more associated with Hindi, even though these things are very messy. And beside Guru Tegh Bahadur, there's a jogi. There's a small person who is dark, whose skin is dark. They're probably covered in ashes. They have kind of knotted hair. They look as if they might be very young, but it's difficult to say because their body is shaved, their beard is shaved, right? And this person, whom you see in all kinds of illustrations of manuscripts and so on in South Asia from the 17th century to the 19th century, it's impossible to say whether they are Hindu, Sikh, Muslim, what their gender is, what their age is. Who knows what they are? And in particular, I think most importantly, they represent something between life and death, right? Their body is smeared with ashes, indicating a proximity to death. So this kind of unnameable figure, this figure who has no name, for me is very important. I think that. That kind of figure enables this endless search for meaning that we could take as a sort of method for approaching the Sikh gallery. Okay, so I think that I'm going to pass it on to Balbir and Megha, and I'm going to, I have a lot to say, but I'm going to save it for the Q&A. But I just wanted to put those maybe three questions out there for you. The question of the category of religion in connection with, the idea of the Sikh and Sikhi versus Sikhism, the opportunities for local artists, and the question of meaning and the fixability or non-fixability of meaning. Thank you.
We have a presentation switchover that's happening that I did not have the technical skills to do myself. And we'll just wait for that, and then I'll introduce Balbir.
Is this on? It's on. I'm just whispering. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Benoit. Balbir K. Singh is Assistant Professor of Art and Racial Justice in the Department of Art History, as well as a nominee for a Canada Research Chair within the Faculty of Fine Arts at Concordia University. Balbir's work centers on the racial, gendered, and sexual politics of embodiment, surveillance, and policing. She's currently at work on her first book manuscript entitled Militant Bodies, Racial Religious Opacity and the Minoritarian Self-Defense, which takes a materialist feminist approach to explore questions focusing on post-9/11 racial and religious hyper-policing of Muslim and Sikh bodies. She has articles published in a number of academic journals and serves as review editor for Art Journal. And we're very excited to have her here and talking about the collection.
Thank you, Sajdeep. Can you guys hear me? Yes, great. I am one of those people who's very formal about presentations, so I have a very long PowerPoint where I'm going to go through things very quickly. So please bear with me. And I just want to first thank Sajdeep for the invitation to speak on this panel. Thanks to Pasha and Megha, whose insights and commitments help inform my comments today. Of course. Thank you to Laura, Benoit, and the museum staff for their help in making today's panel possible. Also, thank you for being here today to everyone in the audience, because it's unseasonably warm and you could be doing so many things. So I'll begin with the personal. I was born in the US as the third of 4 daughters to Punjabi Sikh parents in November 1984. My parents saw my arrival as a sign, coming weeks after such harrowing news and scenes taking place in India. Such a year and month is particularly meaningful for Sikhs across the world. It refers to the persistent memory and trauma faced by Sikhs across India, particularly in Delhi, as a result of the genocide of Sikhs at that time. Such forms of targeted murder were the result of the killing of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi by 2 of her Sikh bodyguards for her role in enabling and helping design Operation Blue Star, an attack on Sikhism's holiest site, Harmandir Sahib, or the Golden Temple, as it is widely known, in June of that same year. Such an operation was a way to target what the Indian state, as well as British Thatcher-led collaborators, saw as Sikh militancy or terrorism. It is unsurprising for Sikhs that the number of the genocide are debated, that the term genocide is debated, that the historical injury and trauma we have faced as Qawm, as a community, remain up for debate. And not only up for debate, but minimized, disregarded, and disavowed. I carry this with me as I think about this time of year, early November, and having visited and taken in some of the selected works on display in the art collection, the Kapani Sikh art collection. It informs how I have read Sikh art prior to this collection, and it informs how I engage with the work of contemporary Sikh visual art. I am interested in what I see as the field of contemporary Sikh diasporic aesthetics. From the collection, I am particularly taken by Jatinder Singh Duralai's 2020 piece, The Decapitator. So let's see it here. The Decapitator is done in Duralai's signature style, an homage to Mughal-era Sikh miniature painting. It depicts a turbaned Sikh man, shirtless, donning a kirpan, one of the Panj Kakars, or 5 Ks, and holding a sword with a recently decapitated head of another man. He wears, too, a partially obscured shield opposite of his kirpan, of course. But the kicker is his donning of an Adidas sweatshirt tied around his waist, placed on top of what appear to be Adidas shorts, given the side's clear 3 stripes. Such a contemporary deployment of the global corporate brand signals to the viewer a kind of playful reworking on 2 levels. On one level, Duralai is noting the specific historical context as contemporary, as one locatable in a hyper-capitalist milieu where brand recognition is part of our visual common sense. On another level, such a work subverts both the art historical form of Mughal-era Sikh miniature art alongside the Sikh-specific images of shaheed, or martyrs, which are an important part of Sikh art history and visual culture. The searing of such images are part of a larger composite of a Sikh visual language. Such language defines historical memory around foundational violence against Sikhs as the place in which to begin a Sikh political education, in which forms of martyrdom and self-sacrifice are made central to the narration of Sikh history. What is more, in the images we see of the many Sikh shaheed in the visual art are their deaths at the hands of others, whereas Duralai, his painting places the central figure, a turbaned Sikh, as the death dealer, as the decapitator of an unidentified mustached head, possibly inverting the usual scene of the Sikh martyr, casting the Sikh as agential, as sovereign, as possibly seeking revenge for historical wrongs. This is just one possible reading, and as such, Durlai's painting can then be seen as blending form, genre, and motifs within this singular piece. Forgive the page turning. The reworking of such specific visual tropes is one that, rather than be viewed as profane, we might render as part of the vital and invigorating work of contemporary Sikh artists. By blending such forms and motifs of Sikh art and visual cultures, Durlai acknowledges the precedents on which he works, while also demonstrating a postmodern sensibility, commenting on and reimagining historic and prevailing narratives around Sikh militancy, martyrdom, and masculinity. Before I speak to further works of contemporary Sikh art, I want to take a step back. I want to note that my work broadly centers artists of both contemporary Muslim and Sikh artists and such. I read Sikh art from the context of the modern and contemporary responses to moments including 1984, 9/11, and the global wars on terror. Contexts that are contingent, relational, complex. Even still, when it comes to the category of Sikh art, collaboration must come at the urging of those with ethical investments in Sikhi and with a knowledge that decenters the usual and the commonplace, the Eurocentric or Hindu nationalist, the acceleration of which we can see in India, targeting Muslims acutely alongside Sikhs and numerous others. Furthermore, I want to note that Sikh cultural production has and continues to be invested in sovereignty and militancy for historical reasons, but it does not mean that those rationales are non-relational. In fact, it is the very opposite. Sikh aesthetics and the contemporary Sikh artists I engage in my work broadly is ultimately centering the relational and what Lisa Lowe names intimacies between histories and forms of violence that were cordoned off from one another, given the disciplining of knowledges, historical and otherwise. Even still, I want to insist on the specificity of Sikh knowledge, of how such knowledge remains central to the production of contemporary Sikh art, that the specific and the local, the relational and the diasporic, still center an ethic and politic of Sikhi that is disinterested in the universal, but rather about what we might better see the specificity of such difference as sacred, even as it appears clear as day or wholly opaque, even as it goes policed or undetected. With this in mind, I want to note that the Kapani collection's existence here speaks volumes, and this will echo some of what Pasha said, that in spite of our location, in spite of what it means to be Sikh in a place where Bill 21 exists as an expression of Quebec's location as part of the geographies of global Islamophobia. While one iteration of racism here might appear through the language of laïcité or secularism, amidst the many other expressions of racism, of course, I dwell here to help confront the contradictions and sit in that discomfort, that unbelonging. Where the specificity of Montreal's vibrant art scene means affordance into a space such as this, where the continued targeting of hijabi Muslims and turban Sikhs is rendered as par for the course, where forms of anti-Asian racism continue to breed and take shape in myriad fashions, including those that express themselves as anti-Muslim and anti-Sikh racisms. It is why the Kapani collection necessarily exists as an important activation site in which to draw in further Sikh contemporary artists, particularly diasporic artists. In other words, I'm here to ask for more, demand more from what can be an important geographic and cultural node in affirming Sikh art and cultural production. Already included in the collection are the works by both Girith Kaur and Gauri Gill, standing out as two important Sikh women artists whose work make firm the place of Sikh women, particularly Gill's photographs, which place women squarely in the frame. Add to that, I think this is out of order. Did I go too far? Oh, well, Jagdeep Raina's piece was the one that was supposed to be in there, so it might show up later. Add to that our recent luck in seeing the brilliant woven tapestry, Chemical Cotton Flowers, centering two Sikh women by multidisciplinary artist Jagdeep Raina, But to demand more, I want to highlight the work of a few others. Take the work of British-born, Glasgow-based multidisciplinary artist Hardeep Bandal, whose work here would be intriguing to pair with Durraiz the Decapitator. Bandal's figure is turbaned with head detached from the body. I'm going to actually go back. Replicated over and over, titled "Money Grows on Family Trees," and such a figure, turbaned with head detached from the body, is seen over and over again, forcing me to consider the sometimes horrifying, depictions in the vein of political cartoons, and to read that in tandem with the scribbled writing through an anti-colonial lens, potentially undermining what is at stake in such kinds of representations. Or in his works here, in collaboration with his mother, is a synthetic wool-stitched sweater figure of martyr Baba Deep Singh, who was remembered notably for continuing to fight in battle despite being decapitated, which Bandal titles Baba Deep Thing by Mum from 2014, which given its placement in his artistic timeline, helps read the place of Sikh historical narrative as particularly influential for his drawings and videos. Another such artist raised and living in Glasgow, Scotland, is Jasleen Kaur, a multidisciplinary artist invested in thinking about material and immaterial aspects of diasporic memory. Okay, that's where Jagdeep Singh is. There we go, Jasleen Kaur. Her work is incredibly rich and layered in relation to Sikhi, wherein she deftly incorporates the space of the Gurdwara, or Sikh house of worship, with the sacred and communal practices so central to their routine functions. Gender is particularly central, questioning the predominant space of Sikh masculinity in both historical narratives and aesthetics. In 2021, her exhibit Flesh and Blood opened at the Humber and emphasized a, quote, "talus woman," end quote, that opened up an inquiry into the body and the organs in which grief is stored. From some of the images here, you can see some of the important signs and symbols of Sikhi. I'll go back. From the feminine geish, or uncut hair in the form of a long braid, to the kirpan, one of the aforementioned panchkakana, from the wooden floor-based book holders, often holding the Amrit Kirtan, a book full of shabads or hymns, to the imaginative usage of channe, a gathered set of small symbols in wood. Another one of her recent work, Gut Feelings Meri Jaan, is described as such. That's really small, my apologies. It reads, quote, "A group of women and gender non-conforming people from Rochdale's Pakistani, Bengali, and Punjabi communities were invited by Jasleen Kaur to join her in a series of online conversations examining and responding to the contents of the local history archives at Touchstones, asking, quote, what do we find when we go looking for ourselves in the archive? How can we alter the course of history through a new script?" End quote. Kaur and the group interrogated how our cultural memory is preserved, exploring ideas around inheritance and belonging, land and migration, ritual and healing. Gut Feelings Meri Jaan is the result of this collaborative process, culminating in a book and a series of films which meddle with traditional archival approaches. Kaur's approach is invested in considering both Sikhi and related immigrant and diasporic communities local to her, and centers both feminist, political, and ethical concerns about the preservation of collective and distinct cultural histories. Kaur's artistic practice is at once careful and exacting, as well as deeply provocative and massive in their undertaking. She is at the forefront of the possibilities of contemporary Sikh visual art. Finally, I want to highlight the work of UK-born, Canadian, Toronto-based artist Nep Sidhu. Sidhu's work incorporates sculpture, painting, and clothing design, and he is one part of the multidisciplinary artist collective Black Constellation. Having formed in 2010, Black Constellation is comprised of many artists working in many forms. Seattle-based Shabazz Palaces, members Ishmael Butler and Tende Marer, musicians Eric Blood, OC Notes, Erica Badu, The Satisfaction, visual artists Khalil Joseph, Makoyo Ali Barnes, Nicholas Galanin, and the aforementioned Nep Sidhu. While I have focused much of my past writing on Sidhu and his collaboration with Galanin, a Tlingit, Alaska-based contemporary artist, especially their non-commercial clothing line, Paradise Sportif, I want to briefly scan the modes in which Sidhu's work is simultaneously devoted to a Sikh ethics that centers what he names the divine feminine, while necessarily investing in creating and experimenting with Black and Indigenous artists, engaging to the learning of the Kufic Arabic script, seeing the through lines of contact and connection, of intimacy across and alongside other minoritarian peoples. Sidhu's work is expansive, inspired, massive, and world-making. To know his work is to understand how central Sikhi and Sikh practices of seva, or service, are, or how welding was vital to his artistic practice, given the centrality of steel and its usage in the Sikh context. Even still, in his collaboration with fellow constellationeers, Sidhu's work places Sikh concepts and practices into creative and experimental conversation with his Black and Indigenous collaborators, enabling an essential and intimate cross-pollination. So it is with this brief overview of a few Sikh artists that I want to conclude with such a demand for more, however it may take shape. The richness of the Sikh tradition and its translation into life-making and affirming work by contemporary Sikh artists, particularly those of the diaspora, is clear. The further growth and flourishing of the collection here, its expansion and development into both ephemeral forms of programming, events, and exhibits, as well as more permanent acquisitions by contemporary Sikh artists, would cement the place of Sikh art as one that is not only locatable here in this city, insisting on its presence given the politics of the province, but as one that understands the transformative power of contemporary Sikh art for the community itself and those in solidarity and an intimate anti-colonial relation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Balbir. We're going to be sending that presentation to the Acquisitions Committee directly. Again. Next up, I have the pleasure to introduce Megha Sharma Sadev. Okay, we have the presentation up. So Megha Sharma Sadev is an anthropologist who specializes in South Asian aesthetics and religious traditions. In addition to her ongoing work on legal structures in Delhi, she maintains an interest in the material and poetic entanglements of Punjabi identity, notably on aspects of Punjabi being, becoming, and possibility. She received her doctoral degree from Johns Hopkins University in 2018 and has held a number of prestigious doctoral fellowships, including the Mellon Sawyer Seminar Fellowship at Tufts University in 2019 to 2020. Currently, she is a lecturer in anthropology, sociology, and history at Concordia University in Montreal. Her writing has been published in Outlook India, Stimulus Respond, Feminist Anthropology, and the South Asian Studies Journal, among others. So welcome.
Thank you, Sajdeep, and it seems like the microphone is working. So my presentation, it's a little different, but it also combines everything that's already been so eloquently voiced, and we'll kind of take it in a slightly different direction. So in visiting the gallery together this week, myself and members of this roundtable, we took in the awe and grandeur, as well as the inspiration of the pieces on display in the new permanent collection of Sikh art at the Montreal Fine Arts Museum. The collection melds together an array of artworks from the post-medieval era to the colonial period of Sikh art, as well as contemporary works reflecting the artistic skill and vision of young Sikh Canadian artists. In being invited to this panel, we were asked to reflect upon new directions in Sikh art and how we can think of this illustrious collection as an invitation into new ways of seeing and experiencing Sikh aesthetics. While the new and the novel may appear to us as uncharted frontiers, in this presentation, I suggest that the new actually appears to us in ways of seeing and experiencing surprise and wonderment through the pieces. In that sense, it requires a retraining of our vision to be receptive to surprise and wonderment. We can call that a decolonization of vision if we wish, but I'd say it's unburying what may previously have remained buried under a distant or abstract gaze, which I'm sure we've all experienced when you go to museums. You feel at a distance from the pieces. So how can we learn to see slightly differently so that we get to experience that joy and delight of these pieces? In other words, a set of points that we learn to see can unfold to reveal, as Sajdeep also mentioned, an entire universe. The Sikh collection is particularly interesting because it brings together two forms of vision that I'll focus on in this presentation. One being transcendent vision. That means visions of splendor, landscapes of royalty, visions of transcendence and sovereignty, power. And the second form of vision that I'd like to discuss, which already has been discussed a little bit, is tactile vision. That means when we see something, we can feel it with our eyes. It's like our eyes have fingers, right? So something like the Fulkari, you want to touch it. You want to touch these pieces of embroidery. It brings out that feeling in you, right? So, if we think about vision in two ways, right? One is we're taking in awe, the sublime, we're mesmerized, we're in awe of these figures of martyrs and rajas. And another type of vision that really makes us want to touch, tactile vision, what we call sensuous vision as well. So let's begin with, this notion of transcendental vision. And so this is very interesting because obviously we have a focus in Sikhism itself on aniconism, right? Idolatry, right? The way of looking is supposed to be at a certain distance. We're not supposed to idolize material objects, right? And make them into deities. And so this is, interesting because it's not an invitation to see and touch. It's rather a bit of a distance to what can't be touched, what's a little distant, what's a bit virtual. It's seen, but also not seen. So, in Kirit Kaur's work, which I have up here, we see this is a very, great instance of this kind, encouraging this kind of vision. She even has eyes, kind of embedded on the left side of the heart. There is a motion upwards, right? Meaning the gaze does not go deep, it lingers and it moves up. The eyes are pulled upwards in that kind of shape. So here, God can be figured without resort to icons or worldly materials and forms, but through a skillful art of seeing. And here we see a conception of God, again, which is not idolatry, but rather evokes portals, the speculative, possibility, the virtual plane, and the notion of perhaps darshan as a glimpse. Right? Darshan being something we take in, the awe, but also a form of a glimpse into another world. So these are shown in the dream worlds and landscapes that she shows, but also as a part of cultivated or guided vision that we learn to cultivate, right? We see possibility, a surprise, entry into a different plane, something unexpected. Right? And my argument here is that it's not so much that it only exists in the artwork, but it's a way of seeing that actually is part of Sikhi, as we discussed, is a way of seeing in the everyday. About the artwork, Kirit Kaur writes, this piece explores Bhai Gurdas's 36th Var, in which Guru Nanak reveals the infinite cosmos in the blink of an eye. Has anyone ever had that experience? Connections, synchronicity, these things. It's quite amazing, right? It's magical. He reveals, he speaks of infinite suns, moons, planets, and the creatures that inhabit them, convincing his companion, the peer, of these unseen worlds, including their forms of life, relating, and possibility, right? So we see these different life forms, very intriguing life forms, the possibility of imagination. Notably, as contained in the intertextual world of the painting, we also see an image of the heart, and which is very interesting because seeing with the heart is also aesthetically strongly linked to Islamic traditions, especially aspects of vision that involve dwelling on forms of otherworldliness, perfection, geometry. And so in Islamic traditions, you know, when you see something geometric, you're not touching that image, but that sensation of the geometric and the perfect, that's a form of vision that points to a particular way of looking at the ineffable, something we can't touch, right? So, you know, between Sikhism and Islamic traditions, we see both of them have this aspect of seeing transcendental vision, seeing with the heart, which are very distinct and differentiated, but they also share a kinship, right? So we're talking about museums. How do we see in museums, right? How do we train our vision to know what we're capable of seeing and experiencing? Transcendent vision, the ineffable, the virtual, are often awe-inspiring images, evoking the transcendence of not only the godly, but as a very, in fact, sometimes human quality of striving. So, you know, we see this work here that Babir has discussed at length on, you know, this reverse situation of martyrdom. So here we also see an awe-striking, almost transcendental, right, sublime, amazing characteristic. And so, right, this is also in some ways it can be linked to notions of sovereignty. What is the notion of sovereignty? The notion that you can strive, right, for a transcendence, rise above, right, earthly enmeshments, social enmeshments. That's why it evokes this sense of wonder, and that's why the images that Balbir showed of martyrdom, they invoke something different, right, something special. So this piece, again, figures a scene of reversal. It features Baba Deep Singh, head of one of the orders of the Khalsa military, who was decapitated during the Battle of Amritsar, exacting revenge on his killer, part of the Durrani forces. Indeed, the sublime aspect of the sovereign, as well as the martyr, has an uncanny capacity to shed worldly relations, Maya, right? So the martyr is very interesting because they shed those relations that we all hold so dear, right? We're taught to not get too attached to Maya. And these figures, martyrs, are so interesting, you know, and so powerful in that, not that they don't suffer, but they seem to transcend that suffering that we all are enmeshed in, to enact a just and rightful violence. Dorhalai's painting explores this sovereign capacity, not only for violence, but for protection of Qaum, staging history as a possibility of the contemporary, right? So it's not fully historicized, this image. It has the clothing, right? We see this is part of the everyday. Do we have autonomous, sovereign martyrs amongst us? And maybe we do. Interestingly, both of these contemporary works that we just looked at make use of gold ink, actually. This harkens, as Pasha mentioned a little bit, to the 18th century South Asian context, the late Mughal period, which saw the introduction of illuminated manuscripts, the use of precious metals such as gold or silver to embellish and illuminate, draw out the light of portraiture, as well as for other hand-painted decoration. So previously, there was more use of natural pigments. So if we actually look at some of these images, they mix historical images. There was more use of a type of natural pigment, but here we see a little bit of mixture of gold as well. So this is actually drawing on both certain types of aesthetics of pigment, as well as aesthetics of illumination. So sometimes these forms come mixed, right? So the availability of these precious metals was able to lend portraits the allure of splendor, wealth, sovereign power, and drawing out these auras. Because if you think about it, right, these are artifacts. How are they speaking to us, right, so deeply? How are they evoking these emotions? Pieces that privilege transcendent vision can be compared to and actually they sometimes enfold aspects of the other form of vision I talked about, which is tactile vision, touching, wanting to touch something, embroidery, right? These things. Artifacts defined primarily by the capacity of the eye to function as a tactile organ, embed itself right into the textures, like wanting to go right in there. So it's interesting because metallics, they elevate the virtual plane in relation to the sovereign. And here we see earlier paintings of the gurus which rely more on detail and texture to fasten the gaze, right? Where if you look at this, your eye goes on those flowers, right? And the trees, right? Your eye gets attached to the image through its textural capacity. So we see two forms of motion in this painting. One is the aura, right? What rises above the virtual, as well as the tendency of the eye to affix itself, to get drawn into textures. These styles of painting share links as well, obviously with which Basha mentioned, the miniature form, Islamic portraiture and painting, as well Hindu traditions of representation, which can help us ask actually the question, as Basha asked too, of how particular traditions that share, imagery or forms of artistic rendering, how they come to be defined distinctly. How is it that we know what this is, right? That this is in the Sikh tradition, that this is not part of another tradition. And I argue it has much to do with intertextual universe, scripture, stories, which give the visual life. So this could perhaps, Laura, also be interpreted as a request for inclusion in the exhibit or digital guides of an oral component, which helps to link the visual and the textual in a multidimensional way. So I have a few, how much time do I have, Sanjdeep? Because I want to.
Go ahead.
Go ahead?
Yes.
Okay. And I don't have, an image of these, but there are these beautiful silver artifacts from the 19th century, the chhatri, for example, in the displays, in the vitrines. So these are engraved artifacts, such as silver miniature parasol chhatri. So it's a small chhatri, dating to the 19th century. And it's interesting because the eye is very much drawn into the detail there too. And it's interesting with the lighting, perhaps, I'm not sure how, we have to keep it dark, so it's a kind of conflict in the museum. It has to be kept dark, but it also kind of prevents sometimes the curiosity to expand itself, right? To go into that image or artifact and see what's there. So this piece dates to the 19th century. It shows a seated Guru Nanak flanked by his companion, Bhai Mardana playing a string instrument, and Bhai Bala holding a fly whisk. While engraved in silver, right, so the engraving, tactile vision, it also takes its cues from architecture, namely dome-shaped pavilions, and the structural nature of the parasol, the protective quality, the transcendent protective quality of the parasol that hangs over copies of the Guru Granth Sahib. The Sikh holy book. So very interesting combination of vision involved there. So I'm going to shift now fully more to aspects of tactile vision that no less are very important and point to capacities of the self, right? If we want to call that identity, I'm not sure, but tactile vision is also a part of it. And I would argue, and Bilbir and I were discussing this, the issue of sovereignty versus autonomy, right? What is to be sovereign? What it is to be autonomous, to feel you have control over your senses, to be possessed by your own senses, right? Autonomy and how the body is vulnerable to and becomes animated by particular materials and their possibilities of action and motion. Best way to look at this is through weapons, right? The collection, for instance, features several pieces of weaponry, a 19th century talwar and chakar. So this is a chakar. This is from the Met Museum, actually, because I couldn't find the image from here. So this is a flat steel ring with a sharp outer edge, and the chakar is designed to be thrown with a spinning motion. According to accounts by foreign visitors and soldiers traveling in Sikh territories in the 19th century, so this is from the Met quotation, the chakar was effective at distances as great as 50 yards when hurled by an experienced warrior. So you can imagine this thing coming at you, right? In the 18th century, the Khalsa and the Akali Sikhs regularly carried the chakar. So Sikh poetics tell us not only of sovereignty, but of the body's close, tactile relationship with other forms, which endow it with the capacity to act and to feel its action, right, in that spinning motion. So traditions of chakras and weaponry are linked in descriptions of battle in the Rig Veda, and also to traditions and descriptions of metallurgy in late ancient India. And so if you return to descriptions of, how these work, and they're very interesting, and there's a lot of poetry, right, in the Sikh tradition, a lot of poetics. So I have a quotation, or a tweet here, actually, from Jwala Singh, who actually has this very interesting podcast, the Suraj podcast, and he goes through these forms of poetry that are very much all about the shapes of these instruments, the damage they inflict, how they move, right? The thrill, the joy, the delight, and of course, the morbidness, right, of how these things act. There's so many shapes. It's a whole inventory, right? So there's a way in which the poetry itself shows, right, how the joy of that kind of autonomy of working with tools, instruments, melding with their action. So we see here a valuation of form and adjectival quality, right, which can also be sometimes mapped onto features and appreciation of the self. And so what's interesting is, because I teach history of South Asia, history of ancient South Asia, and in the late, in the era of kingship, there was in the late Vedic period, when metallurgy had really reached its technological heights, many forms of weapons, it also became to be associated with the brilliance or the splendor, tejas, of gods and goddesses, as well as kings, their tejas, but also even the lohars who worked with these forms, who made these forms, had particular affinities, right, with Surya, or right, different deities or stories in which they shared this brilliance, right? So I think this is a really important aspect that could be brought out. Also because, we all have our forms of brilliance. We're all these unique little tools. We work in different ways. We have our mannerisms and our modes. And I think there's something about this kind of writing that really, these poetics that really value that. Finally, the exhibit draws our attention to aspects of gender in Sikhi, which evokes, of course, worlds of splendor, but also of labor, care, repair, and craft. Our attention is drawn to gender in the feminine, for instance, through the photography of Gauri Gill in the Americans. We also see several works of embroidery in the exhibit, so I don't have that up here, but the positioning of the Fulkari shawl at the entrance of the gallery gives a sense of the enveloping womb and the warmth of the maternal and the textural. In Fulkari, it means sort of this flower motifs, very explosive flower motifs, you can say, done in a kind of satin stitch. The satin sheen of the stitch evokes the power, again, of the feminine and the maternal. I really like the shininess throughout this exhibit, these glittery moments, these glimpses, right, of glitter and shine and splendor and brilliance. Which the satin sheen evokes that, which could also be related to motifs of Devi in Punjab and within Sikhism itself. The same, shawl is ochre and brownish in texture, in color. It's rugged. It evokes something of earthy. It was very important texture, right, for Punjabi aesthetics and identity. The links between the shawl and the maternal home, wedding traditions, gift exchange, traditions of Gidda, singing and lore, meant to accompany women into a strange new place. As well, in confronting the dangers of a new place. These things perhaps could be brought out through videos or, again, audio accompaniment. We could feature the work of classical, modern, as well as contemporary Sikh singers and poets, as well as dance. So in this presentation, I've tried to show how new directions and new frontiers in Sikh art are ways perhaps of refreshing our vision and training our eyes to see what previously was obscured, awakening to the possibility of what Sikhi offers within our very present. Thank you.
I want to thank all of the panelists for these really engaging presentations and talks. And I really think they kind of take us to so many different places, right? And kind of speak to kind of the breadth and depth of the collection that we, Laura, the funders, everyone, spent so much time building up. I recommended some of the contemporary artists that are there, and I'm really kind of excited to see how this whole collection and this project of Sikh art kind of continues to grow in the places that it might take us, right? Just to quickly, think across the panels, right? I offered, Sikhi as a way of kind of, as a method of learning, right? Pasha, you enriched that by talking about kind of searching out for meanings, right? Babir, you talked about, the practice of Nep Siddhu, right? And the whole kind of ethics of seva, right? And how, that is kind of an essential part of what constitutes Sikhi. And Megha, you were talking about seeing as a method, right? And as seeing afresh and anew. And so, it really strikes me that all of those are methods, right? There are ways of approaching and ways of living and ways of doing things, right? And in that, they are like a curatorial methods, right? There are ways of approaching art and art objects and stuff, and things that we can kind of, maybe mutually learn from, if that's the right word to use. Anyway, so I just want to ask one question, because it's already past 3:30, to all of the panelists, which is this question of dreaming. And if you could have any single thing in the entire world for this Sikh art collection and project at the MFA, what would that be? No limits on resources, no limits on anything, on time or whatever. What would that look like? So I'm just curious to throw that forward. I'll offer, one of my requests and things that I'd love to see is, working with so many contemporary Sikh and South Asian artists, is that I'd love to see kind of spaces where they're offered a chance to kind of work through the projects that they're working on, right? To get advice from people, to think, to have a community of people who they can think through those questions with, right? They can think about seva with, who they can think about, new ways of seeing with, and how do we kind of go about making that happen, right? I'd also like to really think about, what are the kind of cleavages that, that kind of divide and separate, Punjabi and Sikh communities, right? Particularly thinking around caste, right? And who are the kind of people that have been kind of subjected by some of these histories, right? And what could this collection maybe do, to kind of empower or think through maybe their artistic and visual cultures? We have a wonderful Ravidasi community, in Montreal, and I think it would be amazing to kind of reach out and engage with them and do public kind of programming and artistic programming with that community. So for me, those are some of my dreams, but I'll just pass it around, and then we'll take some questions from the audience.
Yeah, that's a great question. My real answer is that I want a dance floor. I want a Bhangra floor, absolutely. But my secondary answer is that I would love. And again, this is, I think, something that local artists should answer. But again, I would love for there to be a space for local artists either to exhibit or to workshop or both. No, that's my answer. And for the Pulkaris.
Okay. So there are many ways I could answer this question, I guess. I would love to feature one of the artists I had sort of gone through. I like the idea of an artist residency where, someone like Jasleen Kaur could come and work with the archives, in collaboration with local artists here, and really inform the collection further and sort of lend a particular kind of expertise, for the lack of a better word, but really sort of be able to sort of take time to be a resource while also exhibiting their work. I would love that for it to be part of, the contemporary art section, for there to be an exhibition with multiple Sikh artists. Like, there's many ideas, so I will sort of limit myself to like artist residency and like some sort of collective, Sikh diasporic exhibit that incorporates local elements. So that's something that would be really exciting to see.
I think I already kind of mentioned, I think the multimedia, the sensory immersion, the way to bring in the rhythms that we associate, right, with Sikhi, the poetics, the voices, the visuality, that's moving visuality, right, so that we can braid together these different components in the full experience, right, in a more immersive way.
Is this a discussion now? Can I say something?
Yes, you can.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I really liked Megha's idea of, number one, that she brought up the intertextual, and also, and making stories available to the audience, because it's so difficult to enjoy these items without that kind of context, right? Of Punjabi tales, of the Guru Granth Sahib, and so on. I mean, you look at the items, like the Janam Sakhis, who knows what the resonance is of these materials without some kind of prior immersion in these textual, oral, and bodily traditions. So I really like that idea.
Okay, Benoit. Yeah, I think we'll take maybe one or two questions, and then I have a little group activity for everyone in the audience. Yeah, because, I'm like a teacher, right? I do tutorials. Yeah, right up here.
Thank you for this amazing panel and organizing this. Laura, we need more of this. And one of the artists that comes to my head right away is Dr. Jaswant Gasdar. She has done such amazing work, and her contribution in this city as a psychiatrist, as a transcultural, person who's actually of Sikh background, and has managed to create a whole series of conversations amongst different individuals, because she actually works with people who are struggling with mental health. And I think that's the one person that I actually really feel. And I think the revolving door policy of just having people come through this space, doing all of these kind of things, because art at sometimes, actually what Sajdeep said is, it can be located, but it can also be ephemeral. For me, that aspect is so important, because we need to keep seeing the evolving notion of how we are thinking, engaging, practicing, and dancing.
I can briefly respond. I sent an email to Jaswant the other week. I'd invited her to be a part of the panel, actually, but I don't think she was able to make it. But I think we're really interested in,
Because also she left this province. She almost left because of the, struggles that she was having with the Law 21, so many other aspects with the medical system over here, and it really speaks politically also on that level. Mm-hmm. So I think she would be a great addition.
That would be amazing. I don't know her personally, but maybe you could connect with Laura afterwards. And
she's left art with several of us. I have a couple of her work and a few of her things in our work, which just makes it so connected to the community that she belongs to.
Other questions, comments? Thank you.
I don't know if it's a question or a comment. Maybe it's a bit of both. The dreams, I really liked the idea of just imagining this space where as Sikh artists we can connect to each other. I think there's a number of reasons for that, is that a lot of us work in isolation because there isn't this sort of, there's no network or kind of sort of area where we can kind of nourish our practice. There's knowledge gaps that each of us have. There are gaps of experience in terms of the practices. And also, if you look at what's happening in contemporary art, there's a lot of more and more interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary practice. So as artists, it's perhaps interesting to discover some of those other practices. And it'd be particularly interesting if you can discover those with another Sikh artist or a Punjabi artist or a South Asian artist. That's on that idea. The other idea is that as someone who's working in the arts in Montreal, I see a lot of sort of, I don't know what to call them really, but tensions, maybe that's a good word. Just on the one hand, there's this notion in the North of, there's this very sort of abstract, there's this tendency to render things abstract or conceptualize, which is really interesting, it's fascinating and all of that. But then if I look at, my mother's art practice or the practice that her family have had, it's very much integrated into your daily life. And it's not conceptual, it's not abstract, it's very much a part of your daily routine. So that's like a gap that somehow, like I struggle to straddle that gap sometimes. And then the flip side of that is that who are we making the art for? Partly it's for ourselves, partly it's for our communities, however we define those, but it's also for communities beyond those too, right? So if I come back to our community, however we define it, Sikh, Punjabi, South Asian, and then on the other hand, you have this kind of evolution of art in the contemporary space where it's more conceptual. How do we bring the community to that space? Like, that's a struggle too, I think, because if I think of my parents, like there's a way that they transfer their art through stories. You're talking about storytelling, or like these sort of iconic images. I think of Soba Singh and things like that. So like I'm just struggling with how to kind of connect all of those things together. I think I see that as a huge challenge for the artist community, but then also for Punjabi, Sikh, and South Asian communities. Like how do we bridge those distances? I'm not really sure. So maybe it's a question.
It seems like Pasha would like to respond.
Could I ask the microphone to stay with him, because I think that the story of your father's Peti is very relevant to this case, because it's a case of a thing which takes on a kind of artistic whatever artistic means significance, which is also it's also involved in an act of gift giving, which is very personal. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I didn't think of that. It's a great example. But like my father made a Peti for me for my 40th birthday, so he made it by hand out of wood. So when he gave it to me, I'm like, what the fuck? Like, what is this? But like much later on, I kind of understood where it was coming from, because we're Ramgarhia Sikhs. So part of that tradition is around woodworking, around creating things out of wood. So, sorry, I don't want to get upset, because I'm dealing with the loss too. But it's just that art form, and I think it is an art form, it's not seen as something that's legitimate. It's somebody that does something in their garage or in their spare time, but ultimately connects to this tradition that goes back so far, of artisans who had incredible skill and who were creating these things. But it took me like 20 years after he made it to validate the creation of that thing, because I just didn't understand what it was. So those are kind of problems that we grapple with as artists and as a community. So the artwork that we create in our communities, it's not given a legitimacy in a mainstream space. So that's really troubling. And then if you politicize it, as you all talked about Bill 21, it's just this further sort of, on se sent complètement écarté de ce qui est accepté généralement ici au Québec. On ne se voit pas dans ce qui est présenté Ça nous représente. And I connected back to, as a young queer when I was like 30-something coming out, looking at, magazines on TV in Montreal. It was all like white men and women like this skinny, like, wearing Speedos and bikinis. I'm like, that's not me. But it's kind of the same thing, It's a different version of that exclusion. And so these kind of images are incredibly powerful because when you see them, they legitimize your experience.
Thank you so much for that comment. I want to just respond briefly to kind of this distinction between what's like legible as being, conceptual art that's about philosophy and abstraction versus what's legible as just being like art and craft, like craft and artisanal work, right? And the kind of making of those very categories, right, happens through colonialism, right? And so in the 19th century, right, you have art as a field being established, as a space of conceptual play, primarily for those bodies that were deemed as having the capacity, the mental capacity, which was white European men, right? And so there was a whole slew of racial theory, right, that encompassed all the people of India in different ways, right, and said that, some of those people had philosophical capacity and others didn't, right? And so racial theory imagined like the Jat Sikhs, right, in Punjab as being this martial race that was only suitable for agrarian labor and to serve in the military, right? They didn't actually see them as capable of doing philosophy. And similarly, they didn't see them as capable of doing conceptual art. Right? And, that's just one example, but, in kind of colonial racial theory, they've kind of divided the people of India into thousands and thousands of tribes, castes, and races, right? And then accorded those races with different kind of mental capacities, right? And so to kind of assert this category of Sikh art, right, is to make a claim that, there's a potential to do philosophy, right? It's to actually refuse a racial logic at the same time. To make and then also render, things like that bhakti, as actually a deeply philosophical practice, right? And the whole kind of conceit of philosophy, right, is that it is, this kind of transcendent form of, knowledge. But really we know that it's just, normal people and their thoughts, right? And we have such a rich tradition of that actually, within kind of, what constitutes Sikhism, right? If you think about the scriptures, what is that other than poetry and philosophy, right? And so, Sikh and art kind of are perfectly compatible in a way.
Do you mind if I just have a quick comment? Yeah, exactly. I think the depth and the way of seeing and being and connecting, what you're talking about, the sense of loss is very grave. And I think it's perhaps, the museum or, these institutions, they certainly play a role, or the mainstream culture, but I also think commodification, Instagramization. Now we are seeing more of a material culture of Punjab being put on Instagram, incorporated in certain archives. And, I think that needs to be sort of questioned too, right? It brings a lot of people a sense of, comfort, but in some other cases it leads to further exclusions, right? And the types of narratives that are becoming attached, right? So that, I don't know if the sense of loss gets, soothed by Instagram archive necessarily or not, So these questions I share with you, and thanks for bringing it up.
Did any of the other panelists want to add something?
Thank you for your comments, because I do think there is something to be said about the sort of like way that Sikh, Punjabi, South Asian material culture, I think that's something that is so central to a lot of the Sikh artists we're seeing. Like that's something that is essential in terms of like understanding what it means to focus on, matter and sort of forms of things that oftentimes signal or sort of like symbolize something specific to our traditions. And so I think, it's just, I think, a really important sort of node in which to more fully render like a greater sort of sense of like how we see Sikh, Punjabi, and South Asian aesthetics. And I think that that's part of it, right? Is like the affirmation of what we're seeing, and like being able to like sort of see that as a larger composite of like what we see like on social media, or through the collection, or just through our own sort of like investment in thinking with other Sikh artists, and just like doing that research and feeling that isolation. I think that's a really important point. Like I think in terms of like that question of the dream of like what could be that Sajdeep asked, that is part of it. Is like what would it mean to be able to like have it be a space and a reason to gather and to begin that process to come together. And so I do think it is something that is about like that legitimizing and that affirmation that is so essential in a place that can feel, that can be about that unbelonging that I think is really sort of specific to the local context. And so I just really appreciate your note.
Okay, one last quick question for Swapna.
Hi, thank you so much, Sajdeep, Pasha, Balbir, and Megha for your really complex sort of nodes that are all, departing and also very entangled. And I love the sort of curation of thought that's been presented today. I'm curious about the sort of aestheticization of ideas within Sikhi and the sort of lack of practice on behalf of an artist. So there's an aestheticization of seva and a lack of practice within the artist's practice. So imagery is one thing, but where does practice come into these contemporary artworks?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Did you?
Yeah, I mean, I would say like that. Yeah, thank you for that question. I think in terms of what it means to practice seva and to have that be core to one's artistic practice. I mean, I think in terms of like the case of Nep Sidhu, for example, like I mean, one of his works that I briefly showed from Medicine for a Nightmare is supposed to show sort of the image of langar service and like what that looks like. And so there is that question of like, what does it mean to show service and show this form of seva that is specific to Sikhi, to an audience that is outside of that, right? And so that is part of like, I think the larger sort of sense of like how we understand the art world, art markets. And so, I mean, I think, that participation in seva is core to it, but I think there is also this sort of like through line in his work, and I think in others' work as well. I'm thinking also of like Jasleen Kaur, like what it means to illustrate or make, make images of what might be understood as a sort of sacred component of Sikhi. And so I think that is a really important question. And I mean, I want to sort of like grapple with it further and give you like a more thoughtful response.
I'll say something quickly. I think the question is like, how do we operationalize these philosophies, right? How does like seva materialize? How does, these maybe new ways of seeing materialize? How does learning materialize, right? And all of these kind of methods that we've offered. And I think that that's like precisely what we'll have to work through, in kind of all coming together. And I think that's kind of what this collection is offered, right? A space to work through those questions. And, I don't think it'll necessarily all be clear cuts of like, we're all gonna go and peel potatoes, which is what I'm gonna be doing with my grandma at the Gurdwara probably next weekend. But, there's so many ways that we can kind of operationalize that. Seva could look like, researching chemical exposures, right? It could, take so many different forms, and so a kind of a proliferation of what seva could mean would be a really kind of helpful and generative thing. So we only have 1 minute left. I want to just take a quick second to just thank everyone at the MMFA for making this event possible. wonderful, 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 especially Laura here, who made the collection, all come together, and Benoit, who invited us to do this panel as a part of like rethinking the museum. And so, you know, maybe we can come back to that, rethinking the museum question, and take kind of all of the, you know, wonderful insights that we got from the panelists today, and put them into practice. I'd like to invite you all to please give us a warm, warm, warm thank you to all of the panelists for, you know, their amazing presentations and all the effort that they put into thinking about Sikh art. And before you all go, in the spirit of like this being a congregation and a meeting point, I'd like you to all introduce yourself to one person who you do not know already before you leave. We need to kind of build those connections and whatnot. So just say hello. We've been on Zoom for a long time, so we haven't always had the opportunity to do this. So you can turn to someone new. Yes, okay, thank you.